Hello and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are from coast to coast to coast. Welcome to our first episode of Wildlife Wednesday for 2022. I am coming to you today from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Nanaimo Nation here in Nanaimo on Eastern Vancouver Island. A reminder that we're streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Our episode today is on orcas and killer whales. My name is Hussein Alidina. I'm a lead specialist for marine conservation here at WWF-Canada, and I've had the privilege of living out in BC for the last 15 years and working on issues related to marine conservation, including species recovery and protection of marine habitats, as well as trying to work with a variety of partners to reduce impacts to marine ecosystems. Like I said, today's topic is on orcas or killer whales. We're very pleased to have with us Dr. John Ford, who is a special guest on this program. Dr. Ford is scientist emeritus at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. He was formerly the head of the cetacean research program at the Pacific Biological Station, and also a formerly adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Zoology. John has spent over 45 years working and studying whales, and particularly orcas on the west coast of Canada, and has been involved in some groundbreaking research. John, we're very pleased to welcome you to the program. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Hussein. I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent. Now, before we get into our program, John, you've been around orcas and doing this work for such a long time. What inspired you to get into this work?
Well, it was back when I was a teenager. I actually got a job at the Vancouver Aquarium sweeping up popcorn after the whale show. And I got very intrigued with the orcas there at the time. And then I wanted to learn about them in the wild. So I started as a graduate student in the 1970s, studying the underwater communication and behavior of wild orcas on the West Coast. And I've been studying them ever since.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us today. So we're gonna get started in a little bit with our episode and our questions, but just a reminder to the audience: if you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat, and we will get to them in the Q&A section in the end. So orcas are widely distributed in the world's oceans. They're found in many geographic locations, and we are going to spend some time discussing these different types of orcas today, as well as how they feed and communicate, and we'll be learning some interesting facts about them along the way. So get your pens and notebooks handy, and we'll have some trivia at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to have some fun with this episode too. So John, let's maybe get into some of the questions. I guess killer whales or orcas are actually considered dolphins and not whales. Can you tell us why they're considered dolphins and not whales?
It gets a little complicated, Hussein, but it's basically whales and dolphins aren't really scientific terms. Dolphins can be in several different families of what are called cetaceans, which includes porpoises and all the various different kinds of whales. When a cetacean gets over a certain size, typically 3 or 4 meters, it starts getting called a whale. It's much like the difference between what people would call a boat and a ship. Once a boat is over a certain size, people start calling them ships, but they're basically all the same kind of thing. So that's how it works with dolphins and whales. Now, killer whales are the largest in the Delphinidae, which is the true ocean dolphins,
Right.
and they're far bigger than any other dolphins in the oceans.
Okay. Now you talked about size and orcas or killer whales being larger. How large do they get?
Well, they get to about 9 meters for males, which grow bigger than females. See, males have a tall dorsal fin, much taller than the female dorsal fin. So 9 meters for a male, and females are smaller at about 7.5 meters long. Males might weigh up to 7 tons or 7,000 kilograms, and females more like 5 tons.
Okay, good. Now, they're also really distinct in their markings, and they're black and white, distinctly so. Is there a reason they're that color?
There are a lot of people have sort of pondered that question because their markings are so distinct, that white eye patch on a black body, and there's other white patches as well. And it's not really clear, but it seems like it might be what's called disruptive coloration, which means that if they're circling potential prey in the underwater, the white patches kind of break up the body's outline. So
Hmm.
the potential prey isn't really certain what part of the whale is near them, whether it's the mouth or otherwise. So it's not really clear, but it sure makes them a distinctive, dramatic looking animal.
Hmm. For sure. Um, the other thing about them, and we've referred to this, is they're called killer whales. That's a particularly terrorizing name. Is there a reason they're called the killer whales?
Well, it's likely that they are called killer whales because they're actually whale killers, and it's kind of a distortion of that name, probably. They do prey on pretty much anything they want in the ocean. They're the top marine predator in the ocean, and
Hmm.
nothing eats them, but they can eat most things, including very large whales. And so they became known as whale killers or killer whales. Now, the term orca is a scientific name, Orcinus orca, the genus and species. Orca has a derivation in Latin that is quite sinister as well. So you're not really doing them a better service calling them orca, but a lot of people prefer the term orca, and they're being called that more and more these days.
Okay, interesting. Now, there are also, I understand, different types of orcas, and they differ in some way or form. Can you tell us about some of the types we may find around Canada?
Absolutely. Orcas are found in all oceans of the world, and wherever they are, they tend to live in kind of specialized populations that can be quite different from one another. Here on the west coast of Canada, we have 3 different what are called ecotypes of orcas, and they're called ecotypes because they eat different things, and the different diets of these different types on the west coast define their life in many, many different ways. So we have 3 different kinds. The one we know best are called residents. They are salmon specialists. They eat primarily salmon, some other fish, but no marine mammals. And then we have transients, which are also known as big killer whales, that don't eat fish. They eat marine mammals like
Hmm.
seals and porpoises, especially. And then
Hmm.
we have a third type called offshores. We don't know much about them. They live on the outer coast in deeper water, and it looks like they are shark specialists. They eat sharks, uh, preferentially, including very large sleeper sharks, for example, that are very deep and can get up to 5 or 6 meters long.
Hmm.
They eat sharks so much that the sandpaper-like skin on the shark seems to sand their teeth down. And so they become flat-toothed after a certain number of years, unlike the other types. So these 3 different kinds of orcas live in the same waters on the west coast. They coexist. They don't mix, though. They don't reproduce. They don't
Yeah.
socialize. They just kind of avoid each other.
Okay. So although they're all orcas, there still seem to be distinct groups out there that don't mix.
That's right. They all look basically like orcas, but with a trained eye, you can actually tell the difference in the fine features of the dorsal fin shape, the eye patch shape,
Yeah.
and there may be some differences in size as well.
Okay. Excellent. Now, John, you've been involved in studying communication in orcas, and can you tell us a little more about this, and how orcas actually use sound?
Sound is really important to orcas, much more so than vision. They do have good vision, but underwater, often the water is very murky. At night, it's dark, of course, and they can't see really very far, if at all. So they rely on sound to keep each other in contact within their social group. They're very social animals living in groups. And they also use sound to navigate and to orient in the environment, find food, and these kind of things. And this
Hmm.
is what is called echolocation. Echolocation is much like bats do, where they make clicking sounds, and those clicks echo off objects in their environment, and they can form sort of an image of their surroundings by sound. Now,
Mm-hmm.
sound travels really well underwater for long distances, and it's far more reliable than vision. So much of the time in murky waters, it would be like us trying to find our way around on a very, very foggy day. But they have this trick of using sound to find their way around. And of course, they have very elaborate communication sounds that they exchange from one animal to the other to keep in touch and
Right.
organize the group and lead their lives.
That's really amazing. We have a bit of an audio clip here, and maybe you could tell us after it plays what's happening.
Well, those sounds are very familiar to me. It's the dialect of a very well-known group of whales up off northeastern Vancouver Island, a northern resident pod of orcas called within the A clan. It's called. So those sounds you hear are part of the repertoire of calls, the set of calls that define the kind of language, if you like. It's not a true language like human language, but it's their own set of sounds that they use to give the group identity. So different pods, different family groups of orcas within the resident population have very distinctive dialects. And these dialects are passed on across generations. Young whales growing up in the group learn the dialect from their mother and close kin in the group, and that sticks with them for life. And we can actually identify different groups purely by their dialect.
Wow, that is amazing, and to think that you've been able to study some of these whales for so long that you can actually pick out a dialect, almost like a whale whisperer to us, John.
It took a few years to learn them, but they are very stable, these dialects. When the whales are fairly long-lived, the females might live on average about 50 years, males less so.
Yeah.
But they can live longer than that as well. And they keep that dialect for their life. So the dialects are really quite stable. The whales today are making the same sounds that they were when I was in my 20s studying them as a grad student.
It's interesting. It's a nice form of transmission of knowledge from generation to generation. Now, John, you talked about how social these animals are and some of their social bonds. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Now, how do they live together further? How does it work?
Orcas pretty much anywhere in the world live in groups. They're a group living animal, but the fine details of the social groups can vary a lot from different ecotype to different ecotype. For example, the resident salmon feeding whales on our coast here on the West Coast, they have really, really stable groups. So a young whale born into a group lives in that group for its entire life. It never leaves what we call the pod. And as a result, that young whale will grow up and be a mature male and will be with other kin in that group. And so it's what's called a matrilineal society, where the mothers are the dominant ones. So every whale in the pod are descendants of an old granny or an ancestral female.
Mm-hmm.
For many years, we pondered, well, how do they mate? They can't mate within their family. And it's true. When different pods get together, they mate outside the group and then come back to the males come back to the group, their family group. So very, very, very stable, very close-knit kind of social group.
Interesting. And so tell us a little more about how these pods meet. Do they actually come together regularly, or do they seek out other pods, or how does it work?
Often they travel with other pods in their community, not only within their own ecotype. For example, the northern residents that we just heard, they will mix with other northern resident groups, but never with transient or big killer whales, the mammal hunters that might be in the same area, often within a few hundred meters of each other, but they will never travel together because they only travel with groups that they know. And often they work together in their foraging, in the case of the mammal hunters, to catch a big whale. You might have several different groups working together cooperatively to take down a big sea lion or or a minke whale, some of the things they eat on this coast.
Interesting. Now, we've heard before of something called superpods. What are those?
During the summer, especially when salmon are migrating through some habitats that are favored feeding grounds for the resident killer whales, you get many different groups from the community together in one area, and you can have over 100 whales, for example, all socializing. They're there by the draw of food, especially Chinook salmon, which is so special to resident killer whales. But they also engage in all sorts of interaction, and probably lots of mating goes on at that time of year between the different unrelated matrilines, and so it can be a big event, really, when a superpod forms.
Okay, well, sounds like a whale party.
Yeah, very much so.
Good. Okay. Now, these orcas, the different populations we have today, some of them are endangered, some of them are recovering. Tell us a little bit about some of the threats that orcas face today.
Yeah, there's a number of threats that we are trying to monitor and learn more about in order to promote conservation of wild orca populations on the West Coast and in other parts of the world through colleagues. What we now understand that's really important to these whales is their food supply. These are specialist predators, and the different ecotypes rely on a very narrow variety of prey. And if we take that prey away from them, they seem to have a hard time adapting to a different kind of prey. For example, the bigs or transient killer whales, they prey mostly on seals and sea lions, and through decades of persecution by humans, because we once thought that these were taking away all the salmon on the coast, and that they were unfair competitors, that there was a culling or a bounty program to take down the populations of seals and sea lions. That basically took the food away from the transient or killer whales. Back in those early days too, people used to shoot killer whales directly, and that was a big threat, because it's likely that the populations were reduced by intentional shooting, again, because killer whales were thought to be dangerous predators of humans, and also ate a lot of salmon that would otherwise be valuable to humans. Fortunately, that's ended now, but their food supply, especially for the really endangered southern resident killer whale population, which is down to about 73 or 74 whales in the whole population, we really are worried about their food supply, and that's primarily Chinook salmon, which is a species of salmon that has undergone a great decline over decades by overfishing, destruction of spawning habitat, damming of rivers, you name it. And so we're looking at that very carefully. Other things that can be threats to killer whale survival include contaminants like PCBs, toxic chemicals that we've released into the environment unintentionally, but it collects in their blubber, and it can affect their immune system and cause health problems. And another important one is underwater noise and disturbance caused by all sorts of different vessels on the coast, mostly motorized vessels, that they make a lot of noise underwater. And this can mask the sounds that the whales need to communicate and to echolocate and find their way around and their food.
That's really interesting. That particular interference with sound. We have a little clip here that maybe we could just play to demonstrate that. So tell us what happened there, John.
Yeah, there was some whales that are probably trying to forage a boat nearby. The propeller makes cavitation sound, it's called, which is a broadband noise that can mask and overlap the sounds that the whales rely on to keep in touch, and especially their echolocation. The whales make these high frequency clicking sounds, and the echoes that come back from objects like fish in their environment that they might be looking for are very faint. And so the noise from boats can make it such that they can't hear those echoes. So even if there is food there, they might not be able to find it. So it's one of those things that we're trying to better understand. They can tolerate a certain amount of noise, but depending on how loud it is and what the frequency is, it may be a serious problem for them in heavily trafficked areas on the coast.
Oh, for sure. Now, John, we talked about some of the threats and sort of how a lot of them have been driven by human activity in modern times. What can you tell us about the relationship of orcas to indigenous or traditional people?
Orcas on the West Coast here were long admired and respected by indigenous people, and that continues today. And it was really only when Europeans arrived on this coast that they brought with them a bad attitude about orcas. Basically, they were thought to be incredibly dangerous to people. That they would upset your boat and eat you if you went in the water. And part of the reason was their name, killer whale. It struck fear into the heart of the Europeans. And so as a result, when they colonized the coast here, they brought with them that attitude towards these animals and started persecuting them. Basically started shooting them, as I mentioned, that they were basically afraid of them. And so back when I was young, whales were still being seen with bullet holes in their fins. We don't see that really anymore. It seems like that persecution has stopped now. Fortunately, people now understand that they're an amazing animal to be protected rather than persecuted. And this is we're so relieved that this attitude has changed among all sectors of society.
Definitely. We've got a question here from John online asking, what would the global orca population be roughly?
That's a tough one. We don't really know. The best estimate, that is probably quite an underestimate, is about 65,000. That's the best guess, basically. But there's probably more than that. But the most important thing is that's an incredibly small number for a globally distributed animal.
Mm-hmm.
As far as mammals go, and we're mammals and so are orcas, humans are the most widely distributed mammal on the planet, and probably second to humans are orcas. They're found in all oceans from the tropics to the ice and right into the ice in both poles. And despite this wide distribution globally, there's really very few of them in total. So
Okay.
it's not a super abundant species by any means.
And would they have been abundant before human threats or humans started affecting them?
I think a lot of populations are still at their sort of historic abundance, that they haven't been persecuted. They have in some areas, like Norway, for example. Years and years of directed shooting and hunting, again, to reduce competition for fisheries, took place in Norway. But in many places, like, for example, the Antarctic, they may well be at levels that are similar to the past. But of course, the Antarctic ecosystem has changed as a result of whaling as well, the reduction of the large whales. But large whales like blue whales and fin whales as adults probably aren't really an important prey for killer whales. They're just hard to catch. They're so fast. Or in the case of other large whales like humpbacks, they defend themselves. And most orcas probably go after smaller prey than these large whales.
Okay, interesting. Now we're going to get into the question and answer session in a short time, but just one last question for you, John. You've been studying orcas for more than 40 years, and you've seen and learned a lot from them. Is there, a personal experience you can share about working with orcas that was particularly important or interesting for you?
Well, over the years, we've come to know many whales. Of course, we have named all the whales on the coast. They're all individually known, thanks to photographs of their natural markings, and some are just really easy to tell. And when you're working in the field in a small boat, and you get to know them as different individuals, they kind of have different personalities. But a really important whale was a little female called Springer, or A73. She was born back in 2000. Her mom died. She became orphaned and got lost basically down near Seattle and stuck there on her own. And her health was declining, and it was obvious that something needed to be done. Long story short, she was captured, brought back to health, moved back to northern Vancouver Island, where her northern resident family lives, and reintroduced to her family. And this was 20 years ago, coming up this summer. And she got back with her family after being away for many, many months and lost. And since then, she's just been thriving. She's had 2 successful calves that are growing up now, and she's just as feisty as ever. So it's great whenever we go each year and see her again. Springer's still there.
Wow, that's a really wonderful story, and how nice it was that you were involved in that, and actually people came together and made a difference. That's amazing to hear. Okay, we're going to move into our question and answer session from our audience today. I see one question here from Justin. Any idea why they are black and white?
Not really black and it's a little uncertain. I mentioned earlier that there's this idea of disruptive coloration, it's called, where in sort of murky underwater settings, when a whale's coming at you, you don't know, because of the different white eye patches, where the whale is really. And that's likely the reason. If you look, the underside of the whale is mostly white. So if it's swimming above you, you look up as a potential prey, and you can't see it because it's very bright with the sky, and the white underside of the whale kind of conceals it a bit. So it could be this kind of camouflage in a way. But what it does do is it makes the animal very, very distinctive for us to see when we're out on the water. There's no mistaking an orca. They just are so dramatic in their appearance.
Okay, great. I think we're going to move into the trivia questions now, and as the questions come in, we'll take them. So let's move into our trivia here. I'll just let the question play. So our first question here is, how much does an adult orca weigh on average? John talked about this a little bit in our session. John, do you want to give us any more clues on that?
Well, they are big animals for a dolphin. They're the largest of the dolphins, and they're far heavier than, I would say they're probably the same as several smaller dolphins, like bottlenose dolphins, for example. So that's about the only hint I can give at this point.
Okay, and I understand males are a little heavier than the females.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
By about 2,000 kilograms more.
Okay. So there's the answers. I see some things coming in, but an adult male weighs about 7 tons, and an adult female weighs about 5 tons. Okay, we'll get ready for our next question here, coming up shortly. And there we go. Can you name some different types of orcas? Now, John had talked about a few on the West Coast. John, it was particularly interesting when you mentioned transients. You had also mentioned to me previously that they're called something else.
They were initially called transients. These are the mammal-eating ecotype on this coast. But more and more, they're now referred to as Bigg's killer whales. And that is a new name in honor of the late Michael Bigg, who was kind of the founding father of orca science here. And he started the photo identification program and all the modern studies. So they're now more and more called big killer whales.
Okay, excellent. Well, we gave away an answer to one of them, the transient whales that are also called the Biggs killer whales. The other two types that John had mentioned here are the resident type and the offshore type. And like John was saying, they all differ by what they eat. So there you have it, the three types, the Biggs, the residents, and the offshores. We're moving into another question here. We actually didn't cover this in our question in our session with John, but the question is, why do orcas spy hop? John, do you want to quickly tell us what spy hopping is without the reason they do it?
Indeed. Spy hopping is when a whale turns vertical in the water column and sticks its head out of the water, and it usually holds it out of the water for a few seconds and then sinks again, and that's called a spy hop.
Okay, excellent. We didn't cover that question, but the reason for why they spy hop is because they're trying to survey their surroundings outside of the water. And why is this important, John?
Well, they have good vision both underwater and in air. And so sometimes if something's going on, a boat is approaching or something, they want to take a look at it above the water, so they spy hop.
Okay, excellent. Moving on to our last question here. We covered some of this with a nice audio clip. How do human activities affect orca communication?
And this is an important one because we're spending more and more time out on the water as humans in various kinds of vessels, and communication is so important to these whales that we want to make sure we're not harming their communication.
Definitely. So the answer will come up shortly here, and I'm seeing a couple of related questions come up in the chat, but underwater noise from marine traffic, boats and vessels can affect and interfere with hearing and interfere with echolocation of whales. We have a related question that just came in from Crystal here, asking us, do boats of whale watchers stress the animals?
There's the potential for stress from any kind of boat that's near the whales. Often a group of whales in the summertime around Vancouver Island, eastern Vancouver Island here, might have 40 or 50 boats in its vicinity, kind of moving along slowly with the whales. And we are worried that all this noise will accumulate and add to each other, all the different boat noise sources, and interfere with their communication. We're also concerned about boaters unintentionally striking the whales when they're going fast in their speedboat. So that's a big concern. So a lot of the whale watch boats are actually driven by very, very knowledgeable people who have spent a lot of time with the whales and are very, very concerned about the whales. And so they often are, I think, the least concern. What we're mostly worried about is the uninformed recreational boater who wants to get a picture and inadvertently, in most cases, goes in and disturbs the whales and disrupts their behavior and so on.
Yeah, that's an important point, and it's incumbent on everyone who's out there on the water to be careful and aware of these whales. And there's some very nice resources like Be Aware or Whale Safe that boaters can find when they're going out. So if you're going out, we'd encourage you to definitely do that. We are nearing the end of our, we actually come to the end of our session here today. John, I want to thank you so very much for taking the time to share your knowledge with us here today, and for all the work you've done over all these years, researching orcas and bringing information to us. It's really scientists like yourself and those that create the knowledge, or that provide the information that is informed, that informs conservation and moving forward. And certainly for WWF, we work with scientists and governments and policymakers and communities to advance conservation. So thank you for really the contribution you have made to this work and science.
Well, thank you, Hussein, for inviting me, and it's been a real pleasure being here today.
Definitely, you're very welcome, and thank you for our viewers for tuning in today. Remember, you can tune in the last Wednesday of every month for a new edition of Wildlife Wednesday. We are very pleased to have hosted you and shared some information with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you and take care. Bye now.